Alright, so today's video is for all those chess players who get stuck in the middle of the game, scratching their heads, not knowing what to do with their knights. We're going to cover the concept of knight outposts so that you can take this into your chess games, your chess tournaments, or wherever you play, and apply it to your games and win some more games. We're going to cover the concept of knight outposts, and then we're going to go over one of the most famous examples of a knight outpost, which is Kasparov's historic octopus knight game against Karpov, game 16 of their World Championship match in 1985. Right, so let's get straight into it. Just quickly to introduce myself, my name is Philip. I'm a chess player, 2100 rated video player from New Zealand, and my aim with these videos is to get you up to 2100 or 2000, over 2000 rating as quickly as possible. So outposts, what are outposts? Outposts are essentially squares in the opponent's position that are advantageous for your pieces to be on, and usually a really strong outpost is when no pawn can challenge that square. So if we look at this position as white, what can you see? Are there any squares that stick out to you that would be outposts? For your knight, boom, d6. Why? Because no c-pawn can challenge that square, no e-pawn can challenge that square. So essentially white's plan in this position is going to be quite simple. This is obviously a stripped back position. This is an equal endgame, but imagine there's rooks and queens and all that kind of stuff on the board. White wants to essentially get his knight onto that square, because that starts putting pressure onto black's position pretty quickly. Black, on the other hand, he's got an outpost on d5, so it's not as advanced, but he can get his knight on here and start putting pressure on that f4 pawn. So if we were to look at, let's go back to how that position was. If we were to assess, okay, what are white's best squares and what are black's best squares for his knight? Well, black's got this square for his knight, this square for his knight, and they're probably the best two squares. So white will most likely advance the c-pawn to stop black's knight from coming to that square, but that opens up this square, if you notice, right? So black's knight is going to want to come here and here. Likewise, the only way to stop black using the f5 square is to play g4, but that's really committal and in the middle of a middle game. This is, again, stripped back position. You're just weakening your king pretty needlessly, so black's either going to plonk his knight onto f5 or d5. So he's going to, those two are strong outposts. On the other hand, like we said, white's going to try and navigate his knight to that d6 square and back it up probably with a rook, so that, you know, if black decides to take, he either takes with the rook or he takes with the pawn and creates a passed pawn. That's a very common theme. So let's take a look at another position. Pause the video, see if you can find the best squares for the knights. Assume it's a middle game again for black and for white. Just pause the video. So the answers are, for white, d5 and c5. Why? Because that d5 pawn cannot defend either of those squares, and nothing can defend the c5 square, and the only thing that can defend the e5 square is a pawn on f6, which, you know, it's a committal move. So if you put your knight here and then black tries to kick it out with f6, if it's a middle game, he's essentially weakening his king, and you can come back, or you can actually come back here and then reroute to this square where you start putting pressure on a6, and now the recently weakened e6 square, because the pawn's no longer on f7. Likewise for black, he's only got one outpost here, e4, same as white getting his knight to e5. Black, I'm going to get used to these blimmin' analysis boards. Black, as you can see, can't put his knight on c4 because white's got that b4 pawn. All right, here we go again. We'll get the hang of this eventually. But if white went b4, that would be a symmetrical position, and both these c4 and c5 squares are weak for either side, respectively. Let's take a look at a couple more examples just to get you really familiar with outposts and some of the common positions. Then we'll get into the Karpov versus Kasparov game, where Kasparov just had an absolute brilliancy of a game. So this is a traditional closed French defense structure with the pawns on d4, e5, and d5, e6. What can you see off the bat? Again, similar to this position when we were looking at it with the knight on f5 and d5, d4. That f5 square is one of the key outposts in a French defense for Black's knight. And oftentimes, and this is a crucial crucial strategic move that you want to know, is Black, oops, okay, last time, I promise. So Black wants to get his pawn to h5. Why? Because he wants to stop White from playing g4 and kicking his knight. All right, this keeps happening. So once Black gets his knight on f5, or even beforehand, it's very common for Black to play h5. Sometimes White, anticipating that, will play g4. Because it's a closed structure, there's not much chance that the king's going to be attacked. White sometimes will play g4 proactively, stopping the knight from coming to f5, but then that actually weakens the f4 square. So White would only really do that if he had a bishop on e3 or some really strong way to defend that square from the knight. And White, on the other hand, if you kind of look at the position, he doesn't really have any clear outposts. The only real one is that d6 square, but often Black will probably have another knight somewhere, c7 or c6. He can reroute it to e8, or it might even be on e8 after it moved, and it can challenge the knight on d6 if White ends up putting his knight there. But that's really the only outpost White has. So he will be playing to get his knight there. So he might go there, 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 there. But it's super easy to stop White from getting his knight there simply by playing a6. And then he can't be on b5. He can't be on c4. He can't be on e4. He can't be on f5. So Black's got a very, very simple way of blocking White's only real outpost idea in this position. Let's see, I think this is last but not least. This is a King's Indian defense position. Stripped back again. This is what the pawn structure almost always looks like in a King's Indian defense. And you can see Black has that c5 outpost. White, again, doesn't really have any clear outposts. If somehow he got his knight to g5, he has that square on e6. But usually Black can just stop that knight from coming to g5 in the first place with a simple h6. So again, c5 is the outpost, but that can very easily be stopped by White with a simple b4. So Black usually plays a5 beforehand. So now, if White wants to anticipate moving his pawn to b3 by playing a3 to go b4, Black follows up with a4. And now White can't play this because of en passant. And he's actually solidified his knight outpost on c5 and got another outpost on d3, on b3 rather. So this is, again, classic outpost that you see in King's Indian defense setups. This is last but not least. Actually, let me just double check. No, there's a couple more. Okay, so bear with me. We're nearly at the Karpov-Kasparov game. This is a classic isolated d-pawn scenario. Where is the outpost? Boom, d5. So Black is going to want to play his knight onto d5 because there's no e4, there's no pawn that can come to e4 or c4 to kick his knight. So that's essentially going to become a monster knight in the middle of the board. And oftentimes Black's knight is already on f6, and with the d-pawn on d4, it's just a one move away outpost. You wouldn't really go on e5 because that pawn on e6 defends d5. So if the knight was here, it's defended. Here it's not defended. So here a simple bishop on d3 will force that knight to come straight back. But as you can see, bishop on c4, white doesn't really want to necessarily, let's say this is the position. Black will maintain that isolated pawn. He's not going to take back to create a symmetrical position. He's going to create, he's going to take back with a piece to maintain pressure on that d4 square, on that d4 pawn, and eventually win the pawn and win the game later. So white will not want to trade one of his strongest pieces in these kinds of positions, which is his light squared bishop. So that knight essentially remains unchallenged in these types of isolated pawn positions. Now, with outposts, one of the key squares that always comes up with outposts is this d6 square. You might be thinking, okay, how does one square become that special in a whole chessboard? Well, it's because in almost every game, the e pawn gets moved from its first square and the c pawn gets moved from its first square. And that leaves the d6 square undefended or unable to be defended by a pawn. So what that usually means, and it's the flip side as well, it's the d3 square for white. You can see white will never be able to defend that d3 square because he's moved his c pawn and his e pawn. Likewise for that d4 square. So if you kind of look at it from black's position, these two squares, if he can get a knight on f5 and then on d4 and hammer it in with a pawn on c5, just anchor it in, that's good for black. But in this position, in this particular position, this is a pretty horrible position for black, because not only has he got a weak d6 square, but white's actually got a massive grip on it with the pawn, with the knight, and with the rook. So that's an ultimate weak square where white's whole strategy for this game is essentially going to be dominate that d6 square. And the whole game, the whole rest of the game will revolve around who controls that d6 square. If white controls it, he's going to win the game. He's just going to apply way too much pressure. If black can defend the square, he will probably draw. But this is a pretty crushing position for white. And on top of that, the f6 pawn, the f6 square is weak because he's had to play g6 in order to defend against the threats on the b1 h7 diagonal. So how the game might follow is, let me just put that rook back here. White's probably going to want to either get a rook on d6 and then double rooks and then put pressure on here and then get his knight to f6, and then he's got crushing pressure on this d7 square, and even when you get the queen here or the other way around, which is the setup's called Alehin's gun, after the world champion Alehin, rook, rook, queen. You can kind of quickly see these two squares just become monster outposts. This black light squared bishop is an absolute liability. It's just blocked in by its own pawns. It can't challenge either of the squares. It's the wrong color. If black only had a bishop on, let's say, f8 or e7, let's just say the knight moved to e8 and there was a bishop on e7. That's a much better position for black, because now he's actually got decent counter control of those two outposts. But in that initial position, it was just horrible. All right, so if you've come this far, you're in for a treat. So one of the most famous games with a knight outpost is Karpov versus Kasparov. Kasparov being black and winning as black in game 16 of the 1985 World Chess Championship, where Kasparov became world champion. This game is coined the octopus knight game, because in this position, Kasparov as black played knight to d3. Now, why is this an octopus knight? Well, because if you kind of look at the 8 squares that this knight controls or puts pressure on, it's really just wreaking havoc in the middle of that whole game. All the action takes place around this area, and black's knight just controls everything. And on the flip side, white's knight do nothing. So in this position, Karpov played a pretty passive move, knight back to its starting square, essentially. And as the game progressed, I'll just speed through it. You can kind of see there's nothing that can challenge that knight on d3. Not only that, but in this position, Kasparov played knight d7, meaning that he's going to get his knight to e5. So even if white gets his knight to b2 and takes the knight on d3, it's just going to be recaptured by the knight on f5. So again, it's just such an anchored in knight and just wreaks havoc on the whole position. Like, take a look at this position. White's queen has no moves, has no squares it can go to safely, except the a2 square, which is where Karpov moved it, because his pieces cannot move anywhere, and that's how crippling an octopus knight can be. Fast forward a few more moves. You guys should check this game out in more depth for sure. But essentially in this position, Karpov resigned and lost the game and later the World Championship. So just to recap the ideas that we covered in this video, get your knights to outposts. Look for those weak squares in your opponent's position that can't be attacked or defended by a pawn, rather. Get your knights to those positions. Apply pressure to the position. You will get opportunities for tactics. They just come naturally when you put your pieces in on their right squares. So yeah, go apply this to your games and let me know in the comments what you thought of this video, and I hope you win some chess games and tournaments. Peace out. Catch you in the next one.